This is K4ATZ. I'm going to talk a little bit about ham radio and prepping again. If you haven't seen my other video on ham radio and prepping, I would encourage you to watch it. It kind of gives a basis of how it fits in. But I'll go over some more information too. You see, cell phones are radios. Now, I know this is hard for people to understand, but at their basic level, they are no different than a ham radio transceiver that has a microphone, except they've developed a way for both people to talk at once and not have to push down buttons. Although, you know that Sprint or one of the manufacturers used to have a push to talk on their phone. So years ago, when I was in high school, back in the 70s, which seems ancient now, I had a phone in my car. Now, it was a ham radio telephone, but it was a telephone. So from my car, I could dial a certain code and patch into the phone lines and talk to someone on the other end who was on a landline or a telephone. Now, the way it worked is there's a machine called a repeater, and this machine will take your signal, put it out on a different frequency, stronger. So this repeater literally repeats your signal. Now, I want you to think about that, because think about a cell tower. It's the same thing. A cell tower will take a weak signal. It's usually up high. Repeaters are usually up high, either on towers, on top of buildings, or Stone Mountain has a repeater on it. There are mountains in the North Georgia mountains that have repeaters. Police use machines that relay their signal stronger. So this repeater, back in the 70s, at that repeater site, would have a device which, when it heard the certain tones, would give you the phone line and therefore let you talk into the phone line. But in actuality, it was just a cell phone or a transceiver allowing you to talk to somebody on the phone. So I was one of the coolest kids in high school, because back in 75, 76, all the kids would go, "Hey man, Katz has a phone in his car," and they'd be like, "What are you talking about?" And they'd all want to come see the telephone in the car, which was really a microphone, which on the back of it had a touch tone pad. Now granted, there were rules that you could not talk about business and you could not use foul language, and you were limited on the transmission. However, it was a phone. So now you have the cell phones. Now I want to give an example of a catastrophe that hits, ice storm, tornado, earthquake, whatever, and the power goes out. At the cell tower, or the repeater, whatever you want to call it, there will be generators. These generators have a finite amount of fuel, whether it be natural gas, usually it's some kind of diesel, and when it runs out, or that supply is interrupted, then guess what? The tower goes down. You have enough towers go down, you can't get a signal. This becomes worthless. It's not even a transceiver where you can use a direct frequency and call for help. It is literally useless. So the repeaters for ham radio, when they run out of power, they become useless as well. However, on the higher frequency VHF or UHF frequencies, you can use something called direct or simplex. What that means is you speak directly to another ham, another amateur, and you do not go through the machine. Now on the VHF and UHF, which are higher frequencies, your distance is limited. However, on the lower frequencies, which are called HF frequencies, they're usually 30 megahertz and below, and just to give you an example, FM radio is 88 to like 106 megahertz. That's millions of cycles per second. AM band is kilohertz, which is thousands of cycles per second, and that, like 750 is WSB, so that's 750,000 cycles per second. But there's a difference also in that AM uses AM transmission, and then FM uses FM modulation. Now that's different than the frequency. That has to do with your carrier signal. And I know I'm getting a little technical here, but don't worry about all this. But basically FM is clearer, and it's smoother type transmission, and we all know this. If you listen to your FM radio, it's smoother transmission. But anyways, back to what I was saying. On the HF frequency, which is 30 megahertz and below, so now you kind of see where we are. FM is 100 and something megahertz. HF is 30 megahertz and below, which ham radio operators have privileges on various bands within that spectrum. We have transmissions about 1.9 to 2 megahertz, around 3 to 4 megahertz, 7 megahertz, 5 megahertz as well, 7 megahertz, 10 megahertz, 14 megahertz, 17 megahertz, 21 megahertz, 24 megahertz, and then 28 to 29 megahertz. Within those bands, there are certain frequencies we can use. They are dependent on what license you have and whether you can use voice or data or Morse code. And all that, when you get your ham license, you'll have to learn, and you'll understand. But back to the catastrophe. The catastrophe that I'm talking about will knock out all the cell towers and all the repeaters, but 30 megahertz and below usually doesn't use repeaters anyways. There are some located sometimes in the 10 meter band, which is 28 megahertz, 29 megahertz, and then there's some a little bit higher in the 6 meter band, which is 50 something megahertz. But my point is that you'll still have the ability to talk. Now, if you don't have electricity and you have a radio that strictly plugs into the wall, you're out of luck too. Falcons are getting beat 23-7, 11-1 Falcons. Not playing very good. Anyways, but most amateurs have at some point or somewhere the ability to go to battery. And a lot of the batteries, a lot of the ham gear works on 12-volt battery. 12-volt batteries happen to be car batteries. So let's say an amateur doesn't have any kind of emergency backup. Worst case scenario, they could hook their radio up to the car battery or pull the car battery out of the car and use it. Of course, without charging it, it'll go down. But most hams will have either, a generator or batteries or ability to charge a battery by a solar panel. They'll have something because they understand the concept that in an emergency, when everything else fails, the internet, it'll be gone, no electricity for the computer, the wires or everything or whatever the catastrophe is, you'll have no internet, you'll have no cell phone, you'll have no telephone. The only thing that still is used and can work is ham radio. Even to this day, it's hard to believe that the fallback for the American Red Cross and for FEMA and for everything is amateur radio. This is why prepping and ham radio go together like Coca-Cola and ice. I mean, it's just a natural. But what they don't explain is that you have to be licensed to use amateur radio. It's not CB. It is not Break 19. It is not mass chaos. It is organized. It is regulated. It is very strict as far as where you use it, how you use it, and whatnot. Even in case of emergency, you will have to be licensed to use it. But the licensing is not as hard as it used to be. It used to be you'd have to go down to the FCC. And man, you walked in there, it was like the Gestapo, man. They were about testing, and man, it was intimidating, and it was stressful. Now they have what's called volunteer examiners, which are ham operators who volunteer to give the test. It's much more laid back. There's license manuals that you can see online or buy the book that actually print the questions, the pool of questions that they will pull from. So ham radio and prepping is if you don't have ham radio ability and you're a prepper, I don't care how much food you have or how many guns you have or how much water you have, you are leaving out one of the essential items that you'll need in prepping. It is mandatory, because if an emergency occurs and you need help, or your neighbor or somebody needs help, how are you going to get in touch with anybody? If you're cut off from the world, your car doesn't work, how? How are you going to get emergency supplies in and out? There's only one way, and that's amateur radio. So people who haven't heard of it, or they listen to it in passing, and they're so adamant, they have bunkers and all this, you're missing out on the main form of help, and that's communication. You have to have communications. You have to. Even if you don't want help for somebody else, when you need help, you have to have a means of talking to somebody and getting help. So ham radio is essential. Now, if an EMP went off, which is basically a nuclear bomb 100, 300 miles up, what that does is it blanks out and destroys everything electronic. Computers, phones, cars, telephones, remote controls, and yes, ham radio too. But you can protect your ham gear. You can protect vital equipment like a radio just to listen and get emergency communication. If you get those Eaton ones with a hand crank, they're great. You always have power. But there's a way to protect it. It's called a Faraday cage. Now this isn't a cage like you put an animal in a cage that you get in. Basically what it is a steel metal box. I think you can even use an old metal style garbage can with a metal lid, and you put the piece of electronic gear inside this metal box or cage, and what that'll do is disperse the electromagnetic radiation that destroys the circuitry. It'll disperse it, and whatever's inside that Faraday cage will survive. So it would be a good idea, if you only have one ham radio, to store it in there, or even better yet, have a backup radio so that you don't have to pull the thing in and out of a cage, and put it in the Faraday cage. You can make it or buy it or whatever, along with maybe an AM/FM radio with a hand crank, maybe some other critical electronic equipment. If you have, for whatever, a sleeping thing because you have sleep apnea, that machine will be fried. So EMP would be probably the ultimate weapon, because it wouldn't kill anybody itself, but we'd end up destroying ourselves and just cannibalizing and tearing ourselves apart. And probably for an enemy, that would be the greatest thing they could do, is watch us destroy ourselves, killing each other for food and water. So society as we know it would break down. There'd be no transportation, no communication or anything. But if a group of amateurs, let's say even a couple thousand, protected their ham gear by a Faraday cage, they would be able to communicate from each location, whether it's local or whether it's long distance across the nation, and there'd be a network of emergency communications that would take place. So basically what we covered today is how ham radio and prepping is essential and go together hand in hand. We went over how repeaters work, how they would work in emergency or not work, and we went over the mechanisms of emergency communication and how that is critical, how ham radio plays an important part, and how to protect your electronic gear with a Faraday cage. We'll go over more information and get further in depth of actual using your ham radio for preppers. I'm going to be more involved in educating and helping to explain actual ham radio to preppers. You do have to have your license, but there's nothing that says you can't start learning about ham radio and the lower bands, the HF bands, AM, FM, and sideband transmission, data transmission, how that fits into emergency communication and the Red Cross, high frequency, VHF and UHF, and how that fits into emergency communication, more for local. We'll go over a lot of that in videos to come. But for right now, we're going to leave it at that for this video, and I'm going to pass along my 73s, which if you're not a ham means goodbye and the best to you. So 73s from K4ATZ, that is my call sign, and we'll even go over some information on call signs and how they're issued and how you can apply for one that you prefer. They got it where you can actually get a ham license that you would like, the call sign that you would prefer. My call sign is about my third one, and I did pick it. If you take out the number in my call sign, then it's my last name. So it's kind of cool. But you can do initials, you can do special abbreviations, as long as it's available and as long as it's not anything nasty. 73s.